So the other big story this week has been out of the Gaza conflict, and it revolves around this very tragic event where 7 aid workers were killed in a aid convoy. So it seems like this was an accident, that the IDF unintentionally ended up targeting this convoy. Like I said, 7 people were killed, 3 of them were British citizens. And it seems like this is now being used as a kind of pretext for a lot of Western leaders to sort of take a step back away from the conflict and to kind of roll back their support of Israel. The Israeli government has apologized. The IDF chief has also apologized, promising that they will thoroughly investigate this and find out why it happened. But this doesn't seem like it's going to be enough to sort of convince the West, or parts of the West at least, that Israel is still worth defending. What have you made of this, Tom?
As is so often the case in this conflict, sort of really unsettled by the event itself, and then also really unsettled and confused by the reaction. So, of course, what took place in Gaza on Monday, it's such a tremendous tragedy, such a unnecessary thing to happen. I mean, investigations are going to be ongoing, but it does seem to be just a horrendous mistake at this point. There's going to be questions to answer. Heads will roll, I'm sure, over what appears to be somewhere between an act of negligence or just an act of, as I say, something which no one is obviously going to support. And also that it's worth saying that the IDF were relatively quick in taking responsibility for it. And that's certainly something which you wouldn't see on the other side, shall we say. But what's been interesting, first of all, you've got all the usual suspects who naturally have been very quick to say, well, this is Israel doing what Israel does. And anything like this just gets folded into that narrative of not only just that they're reckless, but that they're kind of bloodthirsty. That's kind of like the implication. They have such a low concern for civilian life that, of course, they're going to go and bomb a few aid workers. That is kind of to be expected. But as Daniel Ben-Ami wrote on the site this week, it is really ugly, and it's a kind of recurring, almost refashioned blood libel that happens in response to either cases of civilian casualties more broadly or something like this, which is just presented as that's what they're like, isn't it? And that's something which is really unseemly. But as you were suggesting in your intro there, it's also had this knock-on effect with Western leaders more broadly, and it's become a kind of prompt for them to express their own hesitancy about supporting Israel, the kind of sense that this has gone on long enough. And it just doesn't really follow to me that you have something like this, a horrendous accident takes place, and it should call into question your support for a state defending itself against a genocidal threat. I mean, that's even if you've had long-running concerns about how much care they're taking in the prosecution of this war, the levels of accountability when things go wrong, it doesn't follow to me that should prompt this kind of soul-searching. I think the only reason that it does is because there is this now lack of resolve, this kind of nervousness on the part of Western leaders. You almost feel like they're looking for anything like this as a prompt to start to take some cautious steps backwards, and it's hard to work out whether that is just a kind of a level of their own kind of war weariness and sort of moral cowardice in relation to this conflict, or the fact that they have started to imbibe some of these narratives, which is that even though they've all kind of forgotten about October 7th and this is just Israeli warmongering and bloodlust playing itself out again. So yes, horrendous thing that takes place, but I struggle to understand why we've had the kind of level of soul searching that's followed.
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between criticism that is fair and legitimate, and I despise this idea that because Israel is our ally and because what happened on October the 7th was, one of the most vile acts of inhumanity that is hard to think of anything worse, really. But also that you can't really criticize what Israel is doing. I think it's very, very important, not least if you're a friend of Israel, if you want Israel to succeed, that there are many things that we can and should criticize. A long-standing criticism has been that they have not been operating with enough concern for collateral damage on the ground. And I think that this is a very vivid example that illustrates that. The convoy was clearly marked. They had reportedly telegraphed their whereabouts with army officials ahead of time, and they were repeatedly attacked with this drone. This suggests to me, I'm not an expert, and I'm definitely, I don't want to be like an armchair general, but it suggests that there is at least a real there was a real absence of coordination between whoever was operating the drone and whoever the aid convoy had spoken to. This is important stuff. This is the death of 3 British nationals and other people from the globe, the world community, should we say? And I think, of course, I don't think this is one of those things where we should just say, well, they've said sorry, so it's fine. It does need to be investigated. And I do think that Tom's point about Western leaders sort of turning away a little is an important one. I mean, David Cameron, for example, is noticeably less warm towards Israel than was his predecessor. But also, Donald Trump gave an interview a few days ago, I think, where he basically said that the war needs to end now. So it's not necessarily coming from people who are, hostile to Israel. I think it's notable also the fact that they've had to attack the Al-Shifa hospital. I'm not talking so much about the morality of this, but the fact that they have had to go after the Al-Shifa hospital just months after they supposedly cleared it suggests that the strategy of basically bombardment isn't working. They've had to go back and take this hospital having taken it already. I mean, these are legitimate questions. What is the strategy and what is the end point?
I think that, again, it's a case of sort of making distinctions, though, to a certain extent, because absolutely, in terms of people should be well within their rights, whether it's in the West, whether it's in Israel, whatever, to call into question the way in which this war is being prosecuted, how people are acting, what concerns are being taken for civilian life, collateral damage, all these different things are really important. It just feels like there's a kind of another discussion going on, which is to suggest that whether it's people in the media or Western leaders are almost waiting for the proof that this was somehow an illegitimate exercise to begin with, that there's this kind of undertone of, it's gone far enough now, that there's a kind of forgetting about the fact that whilst we could question the wisdom of this particular tactic or this particular method of war or whatever it might be, that the reason that they are at war in the first place and the fact that Israel quite rightly feels that it cannot coexist with a genocidal threat on its border has kind of evaporated from Western discussion to a large extent. And that's the thing I find quite unsettling. And there's just a lack of understanding of that being the particular prompt. And even amongst kind of otherwise friends or allies of Israel, whether we're talking about individuals or particular nations, I think the further we get away from October 7th, it's been very easy for them to forget about it because of the fact that the narrative has been so set from the off that that even though October 7th was horrible, this war is an overreaction, that, you now hear kind of the pro-Palestine set talking about October 7th as if people just took a few hostages that day.
Absolutely.
There is this rewriting of history. And I do wonder that there's a section of the kind of Western ruling class which are starting to succumb to that narrative to a certain extent, and are failing to recognise the kind of stakes in this conflict, not just for Israel itself, but for the fight against this kind of new genocidal anti-Semitic Islamism and the way in which it menaces people not just in Israel but across the world, really. So I just feel like there's been a lack of perspective and a creeping kind of moral cowardice which has shown itself in the course of the past week.
It definitely feels almost as if, you don't necessarily have those measured voices. I mean, obviously they do exist, but the people that really come to the forefront in this discussion are not the people saying we need to criticize Israel because of this horrendous mistake that's happened or this horrendous act of negligence, as it may be. It almost feels as if Israel sort of doesn't get the right to be treated like any other state purely because, so many of the people talking about this have immediately jumped not to this was an accident, but to this was a deliberate attack. Because Israel, in their eyes, is sort of this uniquely, inherently evil force that is out to, cause as much destruction and horror as possible. So there is a real sort of, hypocrisy here, don't you think, about the way that we criticize Israel versus the way that we would maybe treat any other state that has committed, horrific acts during wartime. Don't you think? Yeah,
I do agree. And although I have noticed that what is sometimes said when someone criticizes, let's say, people come up with a list of examples of when Western governments have done something similar, which is very legitimate. It's a perfectly good point. However, some of these, for example, a common counterpoint is, well, look how the US reacted after 9/11, to which it does raise the point of, well, was that a good idea? Mm-hmm. Did that go well? I think if you're a friend of Israel, and in fact there are many, many people within Israel who themselves are highly critical of what Netanyahu is doing, and also the fact that his premiership basically now does hinge on continued mm-hmm. military action. There are these interesting internal dynamics that are, I think, very relevant. But what I absolutely abhor is, I think both of you have made this point, that it's like there's almost a sense of that almost all Jewish people are responsible for anything that happens. And of Israel being held to a very different standard than that applied to other countries. There was this furore on social media where the actress Samantha Bond said to the Jewish actress Tracy Ann Oberman, what do you have to say about the 7 aid workers dead? As if, a Jewish woman living in the UK is somehow collectively responsible for, a potentially, manslaughter and accidental killing in the Gaza Strip. Mm-hmm. It's astonishing.
And I think on that point of, again, you don't want, you can point out double standards all day long, but that doesn't necessarily mean that both examples are good and proper. I completely agree with that. What is going on here is not necessarily a reason to, again, kind of create a new standard on that basis. But if anything, I think the double standards are a little bit deeper than that, insofar as people seem to struggle to understand why Israel is at war in the first place. Like they seem to struggle to understand that they have any justification whatsoever for wanting to degrade or destroy Hamas. I mean, I give him a lot more allowances here because he's obviously intimately emotionally involved, but the head of the particular charity or NGO whose convoy was hit on Monday, I mean, he said not only were they deliberately attacked, and he said that very explicitly time and time again, but also that he described the conflict at this point as Israel's war against humanity. And that is a quite common claim. There is airbrushing of October 7th out of the picture. There's a willful naivety of what Hamas is and does. There's also, to be frank, a clinging to claims and statistics in relation to the scale of civilian casualties, which at the very least require a high level of skepticism because of where they're coming from, and they've been criticised and called into question by all kinds of people at this point as well. And it's I think that quote in particular, the idea that it's a war against humanity, I mean, it's the precise opposite. I mean, what they're up against in the form of this genocidal cult is something totalitarian and murderous, and no state, no country would be expected to coexist with it so close to its own civilians, particularly after they showed what they were capable of just 6 months ago. So whilst of course you don't want to be giving anyone a free pass just because they're your ally, nor do you want to be whitewashing your own military indiscretions in the light of what's going on in Israel and in the Gaza Strip, it's quite clear who started this war, why it's continuing to be fought, and what is at stake here. And yet I think increasingly people are losing sight of all of that.